Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. We all want to understand these really complex topics, but who actually has time to read through every single research paper? Well, that's why we're here, and today's topic is super interesting. We're going to try to understand how to make AI even better at reasoning. And no, it's not just about throwing more data at the problem or building even bigger models.
Yeah, that's been the classic approach, right? Just scale everything up, but it's getting to a point where we need some smarter strategies.
Exactly. So we're going to dive into this new research that's looking at something called simple test time scaling. And believe me, it's way more fascinating than it sounds.
Oh, absolutely.
It's all about finding clever ways to help these language models really flex their reasoning muscles. And the best part is they're doing it without needing a ridiculous amount of computing power.
It really challenges that traditional thinking about just bigger equals better.
Okay, so to set the stage here, we've got this research paper that digs deep into this test time scaling thing. And they found something really cool. They managed to make a language model much better at reasoning by using, get this, a super small data set, but it's like incredibly well chosen.
And that's the key, right? It's not just about the quantity of data. It's about quality and being really strategic.
Exactly. Our mission today is to really understand how these researchers did it. How do they pick that tiny data set? How do they actually boost the model's reasoning during use? It's like giving the model a mental workout routine.
It's like fine-tuning its cognitive skills after it's finished school, so to speak.
Right. So let's break down this whole scaling thing first, because I think it's a little confusing. We often hear about training these models with tons and tons of data, which takes a huge amount of computing power, but that's just the first step, right?
Exactly. That's what we call train time compute. It's like laying the foundation. But test time scaling is about what happens next. It's like, okay, the model has learned a lot, but now how can we help it actually use that knowledge more effectively when it's actually trying to solve a problem?
Right. So think of it like this. Train time is school. Test time is the exam.
Perfect analogy.
So we're not focused on teaching it new things at this point, but rather helping it access and apply what it already knows in a smarter way.
Exactly. And what's so exciting is that this research shows you don't necessarily need massive amounts of additional data or computing power to do that.
That's where this whole S1K thing comes in, right? Just 1,000 examples. I mean, in the world of AI, where we're used to hearing about millions or billions of data points, 1,000 seems like a drop in the bucket.
Right. It almost sounds counterintuitive. But here's the thing. These researchers were incredibly selective about those 1,000 examples. They had a very specific goal in mind. They wanted to find the absolute simplest approach, using the fewest resources possible to demonstrate that this idea works.
So they're kind of like expert curators at a museum, choosing just the right pieces to tell a specific story.
Absolutely. And they had three main principles that guided their selection process. They called them quality, difficulty, and diversity.
Okay, quality, difficulty, diversity.
Mm-hmm.
Let's unpack these, starting with quality. What does that mean in the context of choosing these examples?
So they started with a much larger pool of potential questions. They were looking at about 59,000 to begin with, but they knew they needed to be really picky.
So like a massive first draft that needs some serious editing.
Exactly. So the first step was to get rid of anything that had errors or formatting issues. You know, they wanted to make sure they were working with the cleanest data possible.
Right, so like a really good editor would go through and fix any typos or grammatical errors.
Precisely. They called these API errors, where there was some problem connecting to external resources.
So basically anything that was just sloppy or unreliable got tossed out.
Right, and that alone got them down to about 51,581 samples. But they went even further. They also had a list of 384 samples that they pulled from datasets known for their really high quality.
Oh, so these were like the VIPs of the data set, already pre-approved.
Exactly. So they already had a really solid foundation of high-quality examples.
Okay, that's quality. What about difficulty? How do they make sure they were choosing questions that would actually challenge the model?
This is where it gets really interesting. They actually used two other language models to help them with this.
Wait, so they're using AI to help them choose the data to train another AI?
Exactly. And they used models from the Quinn family, which is relevant because the model they were working with for test time scaling was also from the Quinn family.
Okay, makes sense.
So they had a smaller model with 7 billion parameters and a larger one with 32 billion parameters. And they basically gave these models all the questions and looked at which ones they could answer correctly.
So if even the bigger model could easily answer a question, they knew it wasn't challenging enough.
Exactly. They were specifically looking for the questions that stumped both models. They even looked at how long it took the models to arrive at an answer, what they call the reasoning traces. The idea was that the more steps it took, the harder the problem was likely to be.
That's actually really clever. It's like a shortcut to figure out which problems require the most brain power.
Right. And by using these two models, they could be pretty confident that they were identifying genuinely challenging problems. This step got them down to about 24,496 samples.
Okay, so quality, difficulty, we got 2 down, 1 to go. Diversity. Why was that important?
Well, they wanted to make sure that their final set of 1,000 examples, this S1K dataset, wasn't just dominated by one specific type of problem. They wanted to make sure it covered a wide range of reasoning skills. Think of it like this. You wouldn't want to study for an exam by just focusing on one subject, right?
Right, you want to be well-rounded, ready for anything.
Exactly. So they carefully subsampled from the remaining questions to make sure they had a good mix of problem types represented in their final 1,000.
So this S1K is like the ultimate reasoning challenge, with all these carefully curated, high-quality, difficult, and diverse problems. And did they actually find that this was a key to their success?
Oh, yeah. They did some experiments where they trained the model on just 1,000 random examples, or just the diverse ones, or just the difficult ones, and none of those performed as well as S1K, which had all three.
So it really highlights that it's not just about having data, it's about having the right kind of data. And it sounds like it was incredibly efficient, too. Did they say they saved a ton of computing resources by using this smaller data set?
Huge savings. They estimated that fine-tuning their 32 billion parameter model on the original set of 59,000 examples would have taken a whopping 394 H100 GPU hours.
That's a lot of computing power.
Oh yeah, it's massive. But fine-tuning on their S1K dataset to create what they called their S132B model, it only took 7 H100 GPU hours.
That's incredible. It's like they found a shortcut to achieving similar results with a tiny fraction of the resources.
Absolutely. It really speaks to the power of targeted, high-quality data.
And think about the implications of this. If we can achieve similar performance with significantly less compute, it makes these advanced AI techniques much more accessible. It could really democratize the field.
Huge implications, definitely.
Okay, so we've talked about how they created this amazing S1K dataset and how they used it to train their model. But this is just the training part, right? Now let's talk about how they actually boost the model's reasoning abilities during use. This is where test time scaling comes in.
Exactly. And they explored two main categories of test time scaling methods: sequential and parallel.
Okay, tell me more about those. What's the difference?
So sequential scaling is all about those step-by-step reasoning processes where each step builds on the previous one. It's like a chain of thought.
So it's kind of like how we solve problems, right? We think through things logically, one step at a time.
Exactly. And then you have parallel scaling methods, which are more about independent attempts to solve the problem.
So like having multiple people work on the same problem independently and then comparing their answers.
Exactly. And a common parallel approach is majority voting, where you basically have the model generate multiple answers and then choose the one that appears most often.
Okay, I see. So sequential is like a single detective meticulously following a trail of clues, while parallel is like having a team of detectives each investigating different leads.
That's a great way to put it.
And this research focused primarily on the sequential scaling, right? Why was that?
Yeah, they believed that sequential scaling had more potential for really deep reasoning. The idea is that if you can allow the model to kind of build on its own thoughts, to really delve into the problem step by step, it might be able to reach a deeper understanding.
It makes sense. Like if you keep interrupting someone's train of thought, it's harder for them to get to the bottom of things.
Exactly. And they came up with this really interesting method for sequential scaling called budget forcing.
Budget forcing. Okay. Tell me how that works.
Well, the idea is actually quite simple. They basically encourage the model to keep thinking even when it wants to stop. You see, language models have this thing called an end of thinking token. It's like a signal that says, okay, I'm done thinking about this.
So it's like the model raising its hand in class and saying, I have the answer.
Right. And what they do is they suppress this end of thinking token. They basically tell the model, nope, keep thinking, you're not done yet. And they can even optionally append the word wait to the model's reasoning chain.
Wait, like they're actually typing the word wait into the model's output?
Exactly. It's like a little nudge to say, hold on, there's more to consider here.
That's hilarious. It's almost like they're personifying the model.
Yeah, it's a fun way to think about it. And what's amazing is that it actually works. Figure 3 in their paper shows an example of how budget forcing can lead to a better answer.
So sometimes all it takes is a little encouragement to keep the model thinking. It's like saying, I know you can do better than that.
Precisely. And by forcing the model to go beyond its initial, maybe a little lazy answer, it sometimes identifies errors, corrects itself, or comes up with a more nuanced solution.
So it's not just about making the model think more, it's about making it think better. But how do you know if it's actually working? How do you measure the success of these test time scaling methods?
Well, you need a way to compare different methods and see which ones are most effective. And that's where benchmarking comes in.
Right, benchmark. So what do they use to benchmark these different test time scaling methods?
They used some really tough data sets. We're talking about problems that would challenge even the brightest humans.
Oh, so they didn't go easy on these models.
Not at all. They used a few different benchmarks, including AME24, which is from a prestigious math competition called the American Invitational Mathematics Examination.
Wow, so they're giving these language models problems that are designed to stump high school math whizzes.
Exactly. And they also used MAT 500, which is another collection of competition-level math problems.
Okay, so definitely not your average math homework.
Nope. And then they also used GPQA Diamond, which is a data set of really challenging science questions. These are the kinds of questions that PhD students might grapple with.
So they really put these models through the ringer, huh?
They definitely did. They wanted to see if these test time scaling techniques could help the models handle some of the most difficult reasoning problems out there.
Okay, so they have these really tough benchmarks. How do they actually measure how well the models are doing?
They use a few different metrics. One is scaling, which basically measures how much the accuracy improves as you give the model more thinking time.
Okay, so you want to see a big jump in performance as the model is allowed to think more.
Exactly. You're looking for that sweet spot where more thinking leads to significantly better results. And they have a nice equation in the paper, equation 2, that captures this.
So a steeper curve on the performance graph is a good sign, meaning more thinking equals much better answers. What other metrics did they use?
Well, they also looked at overall performance, which is simply the highest accuracy the model can achieve on a given benchmark. So this tells you the ultimate potential of the method.
Right, so it's not just about how well it scales, it's about how good it can ultimately get. And that's captured in equation 3, right?
That's right. And then there's control, which is all about how well you can actually influence how much the model thinks.
Oh, that's interesting. So it's not just about letting it run wild, it's about being able to guide the thinking process.
Exactly. And that's important for practical applications where you might have limitations on how much computing power you can use.
Right. You might need to balance accuracy with efficiency. So they're looking at how well they can make the model think for a specific amount of time or use a specific number of tokens.
Precisely. They want to be able to reliably control the model's thought process.
Okay, so we've got our benchmarks, we've got our metrics. Now let's talk results. What did they actually find when they applied these test time scaling techniques, especially this budget forcing thing, to these challenging problems?
Well, the results were actually quite impressive. They found that their S132B model, the one trained on that tiny S1K dataset, performed incredibly well.
Better than the base model.
Oh yeah, significantly better, despite being trained on just 1,000 additional examples. And it even approached the performance of some of the top-performing models out there, like Gemini 2.0 Thinking, on the AIME24 benchmark.
That's amazing. So they essentially distilled the reasoning power of a much larger model into a smaller one by using this carefully chosen data set.
Exactly. And remember, the data for S1K was actually derived from how Gemini 2.0 reasons, so it's like they managed to capture the essence of its problem-solving abilities.
That's really clever. And what about budget forcing? Did they see improvements when they applied that to their model?
Oh yeah, clear improvements. Figure 4 in the paper shows a nice upward trend as they kept telling the model to wait multiple times. It shows that preventing the model from stopping its thinking too early can lead to significantly better results.
So sometimes all it takes is a little patience. And they also briefly looked at parallel scaling using majority voting, right?
Yeah, figure 4B touches on that. But their main focus was really on the potential of sequential scaling with budget forcing.
Okay, so they're demonstrating that these test time scaling techniques, especially budget forcing, can really make a difference. But I'm sure they didn't stop there. I bet they wanted to understand why these techniques were so effective and which aspects were most important.
Oh yeah, they dug deeper. They did a bunch of what we call ablation studies. It's basically where you take a system and you start removing different parts of it to see what really matters.
So it's like taking apart a car engine to see how each component contributes to the overall performance.
Exactly. And we already talked about how Table 2 in the paper showed that having those three key characteristics in the S1K dataset, quality, difficulty, and diversity, was crucial. But they also did ablations on the test time scaling methods themselves.
Interesting. So what did they learn when they started tweaking the test time scaling techniques?
Well, one interesting finding was that combining budget forcing with a technique called token conditional control, or TCC, gave them the best control over the model's computation and also led to good scaling.
So it's like they found the right combination of techniques to really fine-tune the model's thought process.
Exactly. And they also tried another method called rejection sampling, where they basically generate multiple reasoning paths and pick the one that's the shortest. But they found that this actually led to worse performance as the reasoning got longer. Figure 6 shows this.
Wait, so longer reasoning was actually worse in that case? I would have thought that more thinking would always be better.
It's counterintuitive, right? But their theory is that when the model is on the right track, the reasoning tends to be shorter and more direct.
So it's like finding the most elegant solution.
Exactly. But when the model gets confused or makes mistakes, the reasoning can get longer and more convoluted as it tries to backtrack or explore dead ends.
So it's not just about thinking more, it's about thinking better. And this really highlights the importance of staying on the right track, of having that kind of intuitive sense of what a good reasoning path looks like.
Absolutely. And it's something that humans are still much better at than machines.
Now, I'm sure there are limitations to these approaches,
Yep.
right? Like you can't just keep telling the model to wait forever and expect it to magically solve every problem.
Yeah, for sure. They acknowledge some of the limitations. They point out that budget forcing does eventually reach a point of diminishing returns. You can only push the model so far. And it's also limited by the model's context window, which is basically how much information it can process at once.
So it's like the model has a limited working memory. It can only hold so many thoughts in its head at the same time.
Exactly. And they also mention that their methods allow for predictable scaling down of the test time computation, which is good for situations where you need to be mindful of computational resources.
So they've given us tools to control the model's thinking in both directions.
Right. And they have some interesting ideas for future work, too. They talk about experimenting with different phrases to prompt continued thinking instead of just wait.
So maybe something like think harder or take your time.
Exactly. And they also suggest exploring techniques that discourage the model from repeating itself, which can sometimes happen when you push it to think for too long.
So making sure the model stays focused and on track.
Precisely. And they're also excited about the potential of applying budget forcing to models that have been trained using reinforcement learning. They think this could be a really powerful combination.
So there's a lot of exciting avenues for future research. And they also emphasize the importance of having clear metrics for evaluating these test time scaling methods.
Yes, they talk about how control, scaling, and performance are all important considerations. They basically laid out a framework for future researchers to build upon.
That's great. It's like they're creating a roadmap for the field.
And they also discuss the role of parallel scaling methods, right?
Yeah?
Yes, they see these parallel methods, like majority voting and tree search, as potentially complementary to sequential scaling. Figure 7 shows that in some cases, these parallel methods can actually achieve better scaling than sequential methods, especially when you need to push the model to really extreme lengths.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all situation. There are different tools for different jobs.
Exactly. And they ran into some of those context window limitations with sequential scaling when they tried to make the model think for a really large number of steps.
So there's a limit to how far you can stretch that sequential thinking process.
Right. And that's where the parallel methods can come in handy. They can help to overcome those limitations.
Okay, so it's about finding the right balance, the right combination of techniques for each situation. Now, the paper also mentioned something called S1.1. What's that about?
Oh, yeah, that was a quick follow-up paper they released just a week later. It's basically an improvement on their original S1K dataset.
So they weren't satisfied with just good enough.
Not at all. They're always striving for better. So for S1.1, they took the same 1,000 questions from S1K, but instead of using their original language model to generate the reasoning steps for each question, they used a more powerful model called DeepSeek R1.
So they basically upgraded the quality of the reasoning examples.
Exactly. And Table 5 shows that S1.1 performs significantly better than the original S1 on various benchmarks, including the latest AME competitions.
Wow, so even with the same set of problems, better examples of reasoning led to a big improvement.
It really underscores the importance of having high-quality training data. And they actually tried using another powerful model, Claude 3.7, to generate the reasoning steps, but DeepSeek R1 performed better.
Interesting. So not all powerful models are created equal when it comes to teaching these reasoning skills.
It seems that way, and it highlights how this is still a very active area of research with a lot of nuances to uncover.
Now, one last thing I noticed in the paper was this brief discussion about challenges in getting consistent evaluation results. What was that about?
Yeah, that's a subtle but important point, especially for researchers trying to compare different methods. They found that even when they tried to keep everything exactly the same, like the random starting point for the model and how they selected the final answer, they sometimes got slightly different performance scores.
That's weird. I would have thought that if you run the same experiment multiple times, you should get the same results.
You would think so, right? But these language models are incredibly complex systems, and even tiny numerical differences early on in the reasoning process can snowball into different final outcomes.
So it's like chaos theory applied to AI.
Exactly. And they identified a few factors that could contribute to this variability, including things like the batch size, which is how many questions they process at once, and whether they allow the model to keep generating text after a certain point. Even how the computations are distributed across different pieces of hardware can have an impact.
So it's not as simple as just pressing a button and getting a definitive answer. There's a lot of complexity under the hood.
Definitely. And to minimize these variations, they ended up using very precise calculations for their final evaluations.
So they're really trying to be as rigorous as possible in their research. Now, I know the paper also includes some examples from S1K, which I think would be really helpful for understanding what kinds of reasoning problems these models are actually tackling.
Oh yeah, those are great examples. Tables 10 and 11 show some really challenging problems, and you can see the step-by-step reasoning that the models are learning to perform.
So it's not just about getting the right answer. It's about showing their work.
Exactly. Table 10, for example, presents a probability problem about flipping coins.
Okay, so something that would make most people reach for their probability textbook.
Yeah, definitely. And you can see the detailed calculations and logical deductions that the model goes through to arrive at the answer, which is 43.
It's almost like looking at a student's carefully written solution to a math problem.
Precisely. And then Table 11 shows an astronomy problem. It asks about the sun's surface temperature if it had the same energy output per unit volume as a human.
That's a wild question.
Right. And the reasoning here is really impressive. It involves using physics formulas, converting units, and performing a series of calculations to arrive at an answer that's close to 50,000 Kelvin.
Wow, that's serious scientific reasoning.
It is. And these examples really highlight the kind of sophisticated problem-solving abilities that S1K is designed to train.
So they're not just memorizing facts. They're learning to think critically and apply their knowledge to solve complex problems.
Absolutely. And to contrast this, they also provide an example of where just aiming for longer reasoning can backfire, which was that rejection sampling method we talked about earlier.
Oh, right, where the model got the right answer with a shorter reasoning trace, but the wrong answer with a longer one.
Exactly. And Table 15 shows this. It's a math competition problem, and you can see how the model went down the wrong path when it was allowed to think for too long.
So it's not just about quantity, it's about quality. Sometimes a more concise and elegant solution is better.
Absolutely. And that's a valuable lesson for us humans too, right? Sometimes overthinking can lead us astray.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating deep dive into the world of efficient reasoning in language models. It's amazing to see how these researchers are pushing the boundaries of what's possible with AI and doing it in a way that's both innovative and resource conscious.
It's inspiring, really. It shows that we don't always need to brute force our way to better AI. Sometimes a little cleverness and a carefully chosen data set can go a long way.
Exactly. So, to wrap things up, what would you say are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, I think the main takeaway is that we're entering a new era of AI research where efficiency and ingenuity are becoming just as important as raw scale.
Right. It's not just about building bigger and bigger models anymore. It's about finding smarter ways to train and use the models we already have.
And as this research shows that even relatively small data sets, if carefully chosen and strategically used, can lead to significant improvements in reasoning abilities.
It's like finding the right key to unlock the potential that's already there.
Exactly. And techniques like budget forcing, which are surprisingly simple to implement, can further enhance those abilities without needing massive amounts of additional compute.
It's a reminder that sometimes the most elegant solutions are the most effective.
Absolutely.
So here's a final thought for our listeners. If a model can learn to reason so effectively from just 1,000 meticulously chosen examples, imagine what other seemingly complex abilities we might be able to unlock with the right kind of focused data and clever techniques.
It's an exciting thought, isn't it?
It is. And it makes you wonder what other hidden potential lies within these language models, just waiting to be discovered.
I think we're just scratching the surface.
I agree. And who knows, maybe one day we'll even be able to teach these models to think as intuitively and creatively as we do.
Now that would be truly revolutionary.
Well, we encourage you to check out the research paper we discussed today and explore these ideas further. There's a wealth of information out there for those who want to delve deeper.
And stay tuned for more deep dives into the latest and greatest in AI.
Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, keep learning and keep exploring.
And keep those brains engaged.
Absolutely.
See you next time.